In the last video, we built out the basic components over here for our recipe list as well as our recipe. In this video, we're actually going to take a look at building the JSX for our ingredients list as well as each one of the individual ingredients itself. Then from there, we're going to start styling our application just a little bit so it looks a little bit better than this very, very ugly application over here. So let's jump over here and see exactly what we need to do. The first thing we need is to create an ingredients list component. So in source, new file, we can just call this here ingredient list. Make sure it's spelled properly, just like that, .js. And again, we can use that RFC, React Functional Component, to just create the boilerplate code for us so we don't have to do this every single time. And this ingredient list is going to take a list of ingredients. So instead of here, we could just have ingredients, just like that. And then here we go. So now we have our ingredient list itself. And inside this ingredient list, we want to loop through all of our different ingredients and render them out. And if you remember in our recipe list, we did this inside the JSX itself, but we can actually do it outside the JSX, which sometimes is easier. So I'm going to show you how to do that. We just create a variable, which we're going to call ingredient elements, just like that. And we're going to set it equal to our ingredients.map. So we're going to loop through our ingredients. And we have here an ingredient. And for each one of our ingredients, what we want to do is actually just return an ingredient. So in here, we'll return an ingredient. And we don't actually have a component yet for ingredient. So let's create that component now. We can come over here, create a new file, call it ingredient.js. And then inside of here, again, RFC, and that'll create our ingredient component for us. Now inside of here, we can import that component, which is just ingredient. And we want to import it from /ingredient. There we go. Now we actually have our ingredient component. And inside this ingredient component, we're going to do the exact same thing we did in our recipe list. If you remember, we had a key, and then we also returned our recipe itself. So inside of here, what we want to do is we want to have a key, which we're going to set to ingredient.id, because each one of our ingredients will have an ID. And then we also just want to pass down all the different props for our ingredient, just like that. So now our ingredient is getting both a key and an ingredient list for all the different props for each ingredient. Now in order to actually render that, all we need to do is take our ingredient elements, which is a list of ingredients, and inside of here, we can just paste it into our JSX just like this. This is essentially the exact same as if we put this code inside of our JSX, we just broke it out outside of our JSX. It just makes it easier to work with sometimes. So now we actually have our ingredient list, which is rendering each one of our ingredient elements. So now let's actually make our ingredient element itself. This ingredient element is really going to be quite straightforward. As you can see, each ingredient is going to have a name and an amount. So inside of here, we're going to expect to take in both a name and an amount. And inside of this div, all we want to do is just return spans. That's going to have the name, just like this. And we also want to do another one, which is going to be the amount. And since we don't actually want this to be in a div, we're just going to use empty right here, fragments, just like that, so we can return both the span and the amount, or the name and the amount at the top root level. Now we can save that, and we have our ingredient and our ingredient list completely done. What we need to do next is actually add ingredients to our different sample recipes. So we can just do that by having here a property, which is going to be called ingredients. And this is just going to be an array, and each one of these is going to be an object. So the first one is going to have an ID, for example, 1, and then we're also going to give it a name. For example, we're just going to give this one a name of chicken. And lastly, we have an amount. In our case, this amount is 2 pounds. There we go. We can copy this, do it one more time, and this one is going to have an ID of 2. We're going to want the ingredient here to be called salt, and the amount here is slightly different. It's just going to be 1 tablespoon. And we can copy this all down, again, because our other application here, our pork, is going to be very similar. We're going to have our first ingredient here, which is pork, and we want 3 pounds of it instead. So we can just copy that down. There we go. And we have here paprika, if I can spell that correctly, just like that. And this instead is going to be 2 tablespoons. There we go. Now we actually have our ingredients. Next thing we need to do is inside of our recipe, actually render those ingredients, because right now we're only rendering down to the instructions. This is again going to be very straightforward. We can do almost the exact same thing that we did for the instructions. We can copy this down, except for this is going to be ingredients. And instead of being instructions, we actually want to pass in our ingredients. And inside of here, this props is going to take in another value, which is ingredients from our recipe. And now we can't just paste out the ingredients like this because this is just a JavaScript array. What we need to do is actually use the ingredient list. So let's import that. We can just come in here, we can import our ingredient list. And we want to import that from /ingredient list, just like that. Now we can actually render that ingredient list inside of this div here. So we can say ingredient list, just like that. Make sure we close that off. And inside of here, we just want to pass our ingredients. So our ingredients are going to be equal to our ingredients from our recipe. And there we go. That's our ingredient list being rendered inside of this div. Make sure we close off this div down here. There we go. Now if we save that, go over to application over here, you'll see we have our ingredients, and those ingredients are being rendered. Now the last thing we have left to finish the JSX on this left portion of our screen is to add in the Add Recipe button at the very bottom of our recipe list. To do that, we can just go to our recipe list, and we can add it right here below this div. We can just go down here, we can say that we want a button, and it's just going to say Add Recipe. And in order to make this work, because we're returning 2 elements here, we're just going to wrap these inside of a fragment. So we can just put a fragment at the top, close the fragment at the bottom, and now if we save that, you'll see over here we now have an Add Recipe button. And that's all the JSX for the entire left portion of our application. If we go back and look over here, we have all of the JSX for this left side where we have our recipe list, edit, delete buttons, ingredients, ingredient list, as well as our Add Recipe button. In the next video, instead of trying to tackle the JSX for the right portion of the screen, we're actually going to tackle the styling of our page, because right now, as you can see over here, it looks quite ugly, things are difficult to read, so we're going to spend a little bit of time hooking up CSS into our application to give it a little bit of an overhaul so it's not so ugly to look at. I'm really excited to get started with adding the CSS, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.